Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a true story that feels like it was ripped straight out of a tense cinematic Netflix thriller. We're talking about one of the most baffling events of the 20th century. I want you to put yourself in the freezing, completely isolated darkness of the Ural Mountains. 9 highly experienced hikers vanish without a trace. And the crime scene they leave behind? Well, it absolutely defies logic, science, and reason. So let's reconstruct this timeline of terror.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer gravity of this mystery, we kind of have to start at the very end. When Soviet investigators finally closed their case, they didn't blame a massive blizzard, they didn't blame a bear attack. The authorities actually determined that the deaths were caused by an unknown compelling force. That is the actual official conclusion. I mean, think about it. What kind of force is so terrifying and inexplicable that trained detectives just throw their hands up and use a phrase like that? To really set the scene here, we need to understand the brutal environment they were dealing with. Negative 30 degrees Celsius. That is unimaginably, literally bone-chillingly cold. In conditions like that, exposure kills you in minutes. Survival means you have to rely absolutely on your gear, your shelter, and your wits. It's an environment that leaves zero room for error and definitely no room for blind panic. So our story kicks off in February of 1959. A group of 10 incredibly experienced skiers, led by a guy named Igor Dyatlov, head out toward Ural Mountain in Russia. But here's the wild twist of fate. Out of those 10, only one comes back. A man named Yuri Yudin actually had to bail on the expedition early because he got sick. And that illness, it made him the lone survivor of a trip that was about to descend into absolute nightmare territory.
Here's how the timeline plays out. On the evening of February 2nd, the 9 remaining skiers met their end near their campsite. But the horrifying state of that camp wasn't even discovered until a rescue team showed up on February 26th, over 3 weeks later. And the search didn't even end there. The final bodies wouldn't be pulled out of the freezing wilderness until 2 whole months after that.
When that rescue team finally reached the campsite on February 26th, they found the group's tent. But it wasn't just sitting there empty, and there was zero evidence of anyone or anything from the outside trying to get in. Instead, detectives found that the tent had been ripped open from the inside. Just try to picture that for a second. These are survival experts. They didn't calmly unzip the door to check the weather. Something terrified them so profoundly that they literally slashed their way through their only protection against the freezing cold and bolted into the dark.
So the search team follows their tracks, and about a mile away, right by the tree line, they find the first 2 bodies. Then they uncover 3 more lying between the camp and the trees. Now, despite the lethal cold, the first 2 bodies were strangely wearing nothing but their underwear. One victim had a fractured skull, but doctors at the time determined the primary cause of death for all 5 of these initial victims was hypothermia. They essentially froze to death, almost totally naked in the snow.
But the true horror hadn't even been uncovered yet. 2 months later, the remaining 4 bodies are finally found. And the state they were in, it dialed the tension of this investigation up to an 11. One had a fractured skull. Another had crushed ribs. A third victim, a woman, had crushed ribs and was completely missing her tongue. And the weirdest part? They were dressed in the clothes of the previous bodies that had been discovered 2 months prior. The whole thing starts to feel like a giant puzzle with pieces from 2 completely different boxes when you compare the 2 groups. Group 1 basically froze to death while severely underdressed. Group 2, found much later, somehow managed to scavenge clothes from the first group, yet they suffered massive, brutal, blunt force trauma. The medical examiners actually stated the injuries on these bodies were caused by a force simply too strong for a human to inflict.
And then comes the detail that pushes this entire mystery completely over the edge. When the victim's clothing was tested, they found it was radioactive. In fact, there were reportedly traces of radiation all around the campsite. This makes absolutely no sense, especially when you factor in that there was no outward external trauma to the bodies, despite all that massive internal crushing damage.
Seeking answers, from science to speculation. We've got ripped tents, mostly naked hikers in sub-zero weather, superhuman trauma, missing anatomy, and radiation. How do we possibly begin to explain all that?
Well, the most grounded theory, and the one a lot of experts default to, is that a massive avalanche buried their tent. The idea is that in a total panic as tons of snow pressed down on them, the hikers had to slash their way out just to keep from suffocating. That would force them out into the deadly cold without the right gear, which, perfectly lines up with the hypothermia deaths.
Now you might be thinking, okay, but what about the lack of clothing? Science actually has an answer for that. It's a documented medical phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. In the final, highly disoriented stages of hypothermia, victims will sometimes just tear their clothing off. Their freezing bodies send these misfiring signals to the brain, making them falsely believe they are burning alive. So that perfectly explains the nearly naked bodies found down by the tree line.
But right here is where the avalanche theory completely falls apart. I mean, how does an avalanche cause a woman's tongue to vanish? How does a wall of snow cause internal trauma deemed too strong for a human without leaving a single external scratch? And most crucially, how on earth does an avalanche leave traces of radioactivity on the victim's clothing? It just doesn't add up.
Which leads us to the next big theory, a military cover-up involving a Soviet test missile. A doctor who was actually on the original autopsy team went on the record stating that an explosion could have caused those bizarre, massive internal injuries without leaving outward trauma.
And remember Yuri Yudin, the lone survivor who dodged this whole nightmare because he went home sick? He was actually brought in later to help identify items found at the campsite. But he found stuff there he didn't recognize at all. He pointed out a piece of cloth that he claimed looked military, along with some random skis and glasses that definitely didn't belong to his friends. This made him think that maybe the military got to the scene way before the official rescuers did, and they were trying to sweep something under the rug.
Actually, hold on, we have to stay totally objective here. Because despite all those whispers of a cover-up, investigators found literally zero evidence of an explosion anywhere on that mountain. You can't exactly hide a massive blast crater in a pristine, frozen landscape. Plus, no records of a Soviet missile launch from that time in that specific area were ever found.
Okay, now we're moving into the realm of fringe speculation. Some people genuinely suspect the group was attacked by a Yeti. This theory even got a whole 2-hour Discovery Channel special back in 2014 called Russian Yeti: The Killer Lives. But let me be entirely clear, there is zero evidence of a Yeti. No animal tracks were found at the scene, and frankly, it's pretty impossible to imagine a massive, raging monster taking the time to carefully sweep its footprints away in the snow, right?
And that brings us to the final, most popular, and definitely most controversial theory: aliens. Now, I know, it sounds completely bananas. But oddly enough, when you look at the evidence that science flat out cannot explain, this theory strangely checks the boxes for some of the wildest anomalies in this case.
There were supposedly multiple reports of bright flying spheres in the area during February and March of that year. And these weren't just reports from random conspiracy theorists on the street. Listen to the words of Lev Ivanov, the actual lead Soviet investigator on the case. He said, "I suspected at the time, and am almost sure now, that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the group's death."
So why would a lead investigator jump to something so otherworldly? Well, because it fills the gaps the avalanche theory leaves wide open. It could theoretically explain the weird radiation. It accounts for that inhuman, crushing internal trauma with no external wounds. It explains why the hikers were so utterly terrified they slashed their tent open, and why there were absolutely no outsider footprints anywhere near the camp. And to add a little more fuel to the fire, Soviet officials abruptly ordered Ivanov to close the case. But let's take a step back and look at the big picture here. This is absolutely crucial. We have to draw a hard line between verified facts and unproven speculation. We know for a fact the tent was slashed from the inside. We know they died of hypothermia and severe trauma. We know there was radiation. But every single explanation we have, whether it's an avalanche, a secret missile strike, a Yeti, or extraterrestrials, is entirely unproven. They're just guesses trying to fill a massive, terrifying void of information.
And because there just isn't enough concrete data to definitively connect the evidence to any one cause, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains officially, frustratingly, unsolved. For decades, experts, internet sleuths, and scientists have analyzed and reanalyzed these exact same freezing data points. But no single theory can completely close the book on what happened that night in 1959.
Which leaves us with this final haunting question. Will we ever truly know what compelling force drove 9 experienced survivalists to slash open their own tent and run out to their deaths in the freezing dark? Or are some mysteries simply meant to stay buried out there in the snow? I want you to think about that, look at the evidence we laid out today, and decide for yourself. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep your curiosity sharp.